A frontiersman thought he was alone in the snow until he discovered a child shivering behind a rock. What began as a simple act of mercy would lead to a bond neither of them expected. And years later, in a moment of life or death, that bond would be tested in the most dramatic way. Thank you so much for watching and for all your comments. Let me know at the end if you like the story, and where you're watching from and why you're following this. The bitter winter of 1865 had descended upon the Montana Territory with unforgiving force. Samuel Wheeler, a weathered frontiersman with eyes the color of faded denim, trudged through knee-deep snow, the biting wind stinging his face as he made his way back to his cabin. After 3 days of hunting with little success, all he had to show for his efforts was a single rabbit slung over his shoulder. As he navigated the familiar path through the pine forest, something unusual caught his eye: a small trail of disturbed snow leading behind a cluster of boulders. Samuel paused, hand instinctively moving to the rifle slung across his back. Years of living on the frontier had taught him caution. "Hello?" he called out, his breath visible in the frigid air. "Anyone there?" When no response came, he cautiously approached the boulders. What he found stopped him in his tracks. Huddled in a small crevice, nearly blue with cold, was a little Apache girl no more than 6 years old. Her dark eyes, wide with fear, stared up at him. "Good Lord," Samuel whispered. He knelt down slowly, trying not to frighten her further. "What are you doing out here all alone, little one?" The child only pressed herself deeper into the crevice, trembling violently from cold and fear. Samuel glanced around, searching for any sign of her people. The Apache tribes rarely ventured this far north, especially in winter. Something terrible must have happened. "I won't hurt you," he said softly, removing his worn leather glove and extending his hand. "You'll freeze to death out here." When she made no move to take his hand, Samuel sighed and unwrapped his woolen scarf. With slow, deliberate movements, he draped it around her tiny shoulders. "My cabin's not far. There's food and fire," he explained, pointing in the direction of his home. "Food," he repeated, mimicking eating. The girl's eyes followed his gestures, a flicker of understanding crossing her face. She was clearly starving and freezing. After a moment's hesitation, she allowed Samuel to lift her from her hiding place. She weighed almost nothing in his arms. "That's it," he murmured. "Let's get you warm." The walk back to his cabin seemed longer with the precious cargo in his arms. By the time he pushed open the wooden door with his shoulder, the girl had stopped shivering, which worried him even more. Samuel's cabin was modest but warm, the embers in the stone fireplace still glowing. He gently set the child down on his cot and quickly built up the fire until flames danced cheerfully, casting golden light across the wooden walls. "My name is Samuel," he said, pointing to himself as he put a pot of stew on to heat. "Samuel." "The Gaza." Girl watched him with solemn eyes but remained silent. Over the next few days, Samuel tried to communicate with the child, who still hadn't spoken a word. He called her Little Doe for her cautious, watchful nature. He fashioned crude dolls from corn husks and whittled small wooden animals to coax a smile from her. Gradually her fear began to recede. On the 5th night, as a blizzard howled outside the cabin windows, Samuel sat by the fire mending a torn shirt. Little Doe sat cross-legged on the bearskin rug, playing with the wooden figures he had made. "Nijoni," she suddenly whispered, so softly Samuel almost missed it. He looked up, surprised. What was that? The girl touched one of the wooden animals, a little horse. "Nijoni," she repeated, a bit louder. Samuel smiled. "Nijoni," he echoed. "Is that what you call it?" She shook her head and pointed to herself. "Nijoni." Understanding dawned on Samuel's weathered face. "That's your name?" She nodded once, solemnly. "Nijoni," Samuel repeated carefully. "It's a beautiful name." For the first time since he had found her, Nijoni's lips curved into a tentative smile. As winter slowly released its grip on the mountains, Samuel faced a difficult decision. Spring would make it possible to travel to the nearest settlement, where he could seek help finding Nijoni's people. Yet the thought of parting with the child, who had brought unexpected joy to his solitary existence, filled him with a strange sadness. One evening, as they shared a meal of rabbit stew, Samuel broached the subject. "Soon we could try to find your family," he said carefully, not sure how much she understood. Nijoni looked up from her bowl, her dark eyes suddenly filling with tears. She shook her head vigorously and spoke the most words he had heard from her yet. "All gone, soldiers came, everyone sleeping. I hide, everyone gone." Samuel's heart sank as the meaning of her broken words became clear. He had heard rumors of military actions against native encampments, but had hoped Nijoni had merely been separated from her people. "You have no one left?" he asked gently. She pointed at him, her small finger unwavering. "You." In that moment, Samuel Wheeler, who had spent 15 years alone on the frontier, made a decision that would change both their lives forever. "Yes," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You have me now. And I have you, little doe." 8 years passed like water flowing down the mountain stream surrounding Samuel's cabin. Nijoni, no longer the frightened child found in the snow, had grown into a capable young woman of 14, with a quiet strength that reminded Samuel of the mountains themselves. They had settled into a life together, neither fully belonging to the white man's world nor to the Apache traditions. Samuel had taught Nijoni everything he knew about surviving in the wilderness: how to track animals, set traps, and predict weather changes from the behavior of birds and insects. In return, she had shared fragments of her people's knowledge: which plants could heal wounds, how to move silently through the forest, and words from her native tongue that Samuel carefully committed to memory. "You're holding the knife wrong again," Nijoni said with a hint of amusement as she watched Samuel awkwardly attempting to scrape a deer hide. "After all these years, you still grip it like you're stabbing something." Samuel chuckled, adjusting his hold. "I reckon some old dogs struggle with new tricks." Their cabin had expanded over the years, a second room added for Nijoni, shelves filled with books Samuel traded for during their infrequent trips to the nearest settlement, and a small garden where they grew vegetables during the brief mountain summers. "Samuel," Nijoni said that evening as they sat by the fire, her voice uncharacteristically hesitant, "when we go to town next month, I want to visit the school." Samuel looked up from the fishing hooks he was crafting. "The school? What for?" "To learn," she replied simply. "There are things in your books I don't understand, and I want to learn to write better." Samuel's brow furrowed. Their visits to the settlement were always brief and tense. Despite the years that had passed since the war, prejudice against natives remained strong in the territory. "You know how people are in town," he said carefully. "They might not welcome you." "I know," Nijoni acknowledged, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "But I still want to try." Samuel studied her determined face and recognized the stubborn set of her jaw, the same expression she'd worn when she'd insisted on learning to hunt with a rifle at age 10. "All right," he conceded. "We'll speak to Mrs. Davis, the schoolteacher. She seems a fair-minded woman." Nijoni smiled, relief evident in her features. "Thank you." Their journey to the settlement the following month proved more eventful than either had anticipated. As they approached the cluster of wooden buildings that comprised the town of Pinecrest, they noticed unusual activity wagons loaded with supplies, men carrying rifles, and an atmosphere of tension. "Something's happened," Samuel muttered as they tethered their horses outside the general store. Inside, the normally quiet store buzzed with conversation. The proprietor, Harold Jenkins, nodded in recognition as Samuel entered with Nijoni following close behind. "Wheeler," Jenkins greeted him. "Unusual to see you this time of year." "Just needed some supplies," Samuel replied casually. "Town seems busy." Jenkins lowered his voice. "There's been trouble with renegades. A homestead was raided 20 miles south, family killed, livestock stolen." Samuel felt Najoni stiffen beside him. Renegades? He asked, keeping his tone. Neutral. Apache, Jenkins spat. Army's been called in. Captain Morris and his men arrived yesterday. They're organizing a search party. His gaze shifted to Najoni, his expression hardening. Surprised you still keep that one around, Wheeler. Never know when they might revert to their savage nature. Samuel's hand tightened around the list of supplies he was holding. Najoni. Is my family, Jenkins? I'd appreciate you keeping such thoughts to yourself. The tension in the store thickened. Several customers had stopped to watch the exchange. No offense meant, Jenkins said insincerely. Just stating facts. Everyone knows you can't civilize an Indian. Before Samuel could respond, the store's door swung open, and a uniformed soldier entered, followed by two others. The insignia on his shoulder marked him as Captain Morris. We need volunteers for a tracking party, the captain announced without preamble. Any men with knowledge of the territory would be welcome. His gaze swept the store and landed on Najoni. Something in his eyes changed, a flash of calculation that made Samuel instinctively step closer to her. You there, Morris addressed Samuel. That girl, she's Apache, isn't she? She's my daughter, Samuel replied firmly. The captain's mouth curved into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Interesting. She might be useful. The renegades were tracking our Apache. She could help us communicate if we catch up to them. We're just here for supplies, Samuel said. Not looking to get involved in army business. This isn't just army business, Morris countered. It's everyone's business when settlers are being murdered in their beds. He took a step closer. I could requisition her services, you know, for the good of the territory. The air in the store seemed to vanish. Samuel felt rather than saw Najoni's fear, though her face remained impassive. That won't be necessary, came a new voice from the doorway. Mrs. Davis, the schoolteacher, stood there, her normally gentle features set in stern lines. Mr. Wheeler and his daughter are expected at the schoolhouse this afternoon. We're discussing her education. Captain Morris looked surprised. Education? For an Apache girl? For any child who wishes to learn, Mrs. Davis replied firmly. Now, if you'll excuse us, we have matters to discuss. Without waiting for a response, she gestured for Samuel and Najoni to follow her. Once outside, she spoke quietly. You should leave town, Samuel. There's a hunting party forming, and they're not just looking for the raiders. Some men are talking about clearing out all Indians from the territory. Samuel nodded gratefully. Thank you, Elizabeth. We'll go now. Wait, Mrs. Davis said, reaching into her satchel. She pulled out several books and pressed them into Najoni's hands. For your studies. We'll arrange proper lessons when things settle down. Najoni clutched the books to her chest, her eyes bright with emotion. Thank you, she whispered as they rode away from Pinecrest. Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted. The relative peace they had carved out for themselves seemed suddenly fragile. We should pack up and move further north, he said, as they made camp that night. Maybe into the Canadian territories. Najoni looked up from one of her new books. Because of what happened today. Samuel nodded, poking at their small fire. It's not safe anymore. It was never safe, Najoni said quietly. We just pretended it was. Her words hung in the night air, weighted with truth. Samuel had no response. The decision to leave their cabin came sooner than either had planned. 3 days after returning from town, Samuel woke before dawn to the sound of Najoni urgently shaking him awake. Riders coming, she whispered, her dark eyes wide in the dim light. 6, maybe 7. Still far, but moving fast. Samuel was instantly alert, reaching for his rifle. How did you know? I couldn't sleep. I was outside watching the stars when I heard them. She was already moving, gathering essential supplies into packs with practiced efficiency. Samuel didn't question her further. Over the years, he had learned to trust Najoni's heightened senses, a legacy of her Apache upbringing that had saved them from danger more than once. "Take only what we need," he instructed, pulling on his boots. "We'll head for the high ridge trail. If it's soldiers, they won't know those paths." Within 15 minutes, they had saddled their horses and loaded the essential supplies, ammunition, dried meat, blankets, and Najoni's precious books. As they prepared to depart, Samuel paused for a moment, looking back at the cabin that had been his home for nearly 25 years. "We might never come back," he said softly. Najoni touched his arm gently. "Home is not a place, Samuel. You taught me that." They rode hard through the pre-dawn darkness, taking a narrow trail that switched back up the mountainside. By mid-morning, they had reached a vantage point that allowed them to look down on the valley below. In the distance, they could see a group of uniformed men surrounding their cabin. Even from this height, the flash of torches was visible. "They're burning it," Najoni said flatly, watching as flames began to engulf the wooden structure. Samuel's weathered face remained impassive, but his knuckles whitened as he gripped the reins. "Let's keep moving." For 2 weeks they traveled north, keeping to the wilderness and avoiding settlements. The summer weather made the journey easier than it might have been, but game was scarce, and they had to ration their supplies carefully. On the 16th day, as they were crossing a meadow edged with aspen trees, Najoni suddenly raised her hand in warning. Samuel immediately reined in his horse, scanning their surroundings. "What is it?" he whispered. Najoni pointed silently to a stand of trees ahead. Samuel narrowed his eyes, finally spotting what she had already detected, a thin wisp of smoke rising above the tree line. "Could be a trapper or prospector," he suggested quietly. "Or soldiers," Najoni countered. "We should go around." Samuel hesitated. Their supplies were running dangerously low, and the prospect of possibly trading with a fellow frontiersman was tempting. After a moment's consideration, he made a decision. "You stay hidden with the horses. I'll scout ahead and see who's there." Najoni frowned. "We should stay together. If it's someone friendly, I'll signal. If not, having you out of sight is safer." Seeing her continued reluctance, he added, "Trust me, little doe." She relented at the use of her childhood nickname, but her expression remained troubled as Samuel handed her the reins of his horse and moved forward on foot, his rifle ready. As he approached the stand of trees, Samuel moved with the stealth that years in the wilderness had taught him. The smoke came from a small campfire, around which 3 men sat talking in low voices. They wore civilian clothes, but the military-issue rifles propped nearby told Samuel all he needed to know. Bounty hunters or civilian scouts working with the army. He was about to retreat when a twig snapped beneath his boot. Instantly, all 3 men were on their feet, rifles aimed in his direction. "Come out with your hands up," one of them shouted. Samuel considered his options and decided that running would only make things worse. Slowly, he emerged from his hiding place, keeping his rifle pointed downward. "Just passing through," he called. "Don't want any trouble." The men didn't lower their weapons. The oldest of the 3, a grizzled man with a scar running down his cheek, stepped forward. "You're a long way from anywhere, mister. What brings you to these parts?" "Hunting and trapping," Samuel replied easily, the lie coming naturally. "Game's been scarce down south." The men exchanged glances, clearly skeptical. "You alone?" the scarred man asked. "Yes," Samuel answered, maintaining a neutral expression. The youngest of the 3 men circled to Samuel's left, peering into the trees behind him. "Saw 2 sets of tracks back in the meadow," he commented. "Horse tracks. Leading my pack horse." Samuel explained. "It's tethered back a ways. Mind if we have a look?" the scarred man asked. Though his tone made it clear, it wasn't really a question. Before Samuel could respond, a shout came from beyond the trees, from the direction where he had left Najoni. "Got something here, boys." The voice belonged to a 4th man Samuel hadn't noticed. one who must have circled around while the others kept him talking. Samuel's blood ran cold. Without thinking, he raised his rifle, but before he could fire, something hard struck the back of his head. The world tilted sideways as he crumpled to the ground, consciousness slipping away despite his desperate fight to stay awake. When he came to, the sun had shifted position in the sky. His head throbbed viciously, and his hands were bound behind his back with rough rope. As his vision cleared, he saw that he was propped against a tree in the hunter's camp. Of Nikjoni there was no sign. The scarred man noticed he was awake, and approached, crouching down to eye level. "Finally joining us, are you? That's quite a lump you've got. Where is she?" Samuel demanded, his voice a rasp. "The Indian girl?" The man grinned, revealing tobacco-stained teeth. "She's quite a prize. Captain Morris has been looking for you two for weeks. There's a nice bounty for bringing her in." "She's done nothing wrong," Samuel growled, testing his bonds. "The ropes held firm. Maybe not. But she's Apache, and that's enough these days." The man stood up. "We'll be moving out at first light. Morris wants her at Fort Laramie for questioning about those renegades." Samuel's mind raced. "Let me see her." The scarred man considered this, then shrugged. "Don't see the harm. Just don't try anything foolish. Jenkins is quick with that rifle of his." He gestured to one of his companions who disappeared around the edge of the camp. A moment later, he returned with Nikjoni. Her hands were bound like Samuel's, and a bruise was forming on her cheekbone, but her eyes blazed with defiance. "Samuel," she said as soon as she saw him, "are you hurt?" "I'm fine," he assured her, relief washing over him at the sight of her. "Just a knock on the head." The scarred man allowed her to sit beside Samuel before retreating a short distance, to give them the illusion of privacy, though he remained within earshot. "Listen carefully," Samuel whispered, leaning close as if checking the wound on her face. "When night falls, be ready. I've nearly worked my hands free." Nikjoni gave an almost imperceptible nod. "There are only 4 of them," she whispered back. "The youngest one will take first watch. He keeps looking at the whiskey in their packs." Samuel couldn't help but smile despite the gravity of their situation. She had been observing and planning, just as he'd taught her as darkness descended. On the camp, their captors built up the fire and passed a bottle between them, celebrating their successful capture. The youngest man, as Nikjoni had predicted, was assigned the first watch while the others settled down to sleep. An hour passed, then another. The young guard, after several furtive swigs from a flask, began to nod off, his chin dropping to his chest before jerking back up. Finally, his head fell forward and stayed there, soft snores emanating from his slumped form. Samuel, who had been patiently working at his bonds, felt the rope finally give way. With cautious movements, he freed his hands and began working on Nikjoni's bindings. "We'll take one of their horses," he murmured as the ropes fell away. "Head east toward the river." But as they crept toward the edge of the camp, the sleeping form of the scarred man suddenly stirred. His eyes snapped open, instantly alert despite the alcohol he had consumed. "Hey!" he shouted, scrambling for his rifle. "They're escaping!" The camp erupted into chaos. Samuel lunged for the nearest weapon, a hunting knife left beside the fire. As the scarred man raised his rifle, Nikjoni grabbed a burning branch from the fire and flung it at him. The man yelled as embers scattered across his face, and his shot went wide. "Run!" Samuel shouted to Nikjoni, slashing at another bounty hunter who came at him with a bowie knife. They broke from the camp, sprinting into the darkness of the forest with the sounds of pursuit close behind. A shot rang out, splintering bark from a tree near Samuel's head. Another followed, and then a cry of pain escaped him as a bullet grazed his side. "Samuel!" Nikjoni cried, turning back toward him. "Keep going," he urged, pressing a hand to his bleeding side. "I'm right behind you." They ran through the night, the shouts of their pursuers gradually fading behind them. When Samuel could go no further, they took shelter in a dense thicket of undergrowth. Najoni examined his wound by the faint light of the moon. "It's not deep," she said, tearing a strip from her shirt to bind it. "But you're losing blood." Samuel nodded grimly. "We need to keep moving. They'll have horses." "You need rest," Najoni insisted. "I know these plants," she added, indicating the surrounding vegetation. "I can make something to help with the pain and prevent fever." As she worked, gathering specific leaves and roots with practiced hands, Samuel watched her with a mixture of pride and concern. The frightened child he had found in the snow had grown into a remarkable young woman, strong and resourceful. Yet he had failed to protect her from the prejudice and danger he had always feared would find them. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "This is my fault." Najoni paused in her work, looking up at him with surprise. "How could it be your fault?" "I should have taken us further away, somewhere safer." She shook her head firmly. "There is no somewhere safer, Samuel. Not for people like us." She resumed crushing the plants between two stones. "But we have each other. That's what matters." As dawn broke, they continued their journey east, moving cautiously and staying under the cover of the forest. Samuel's wound, though painful, had stopped bleeding thanks to Najoni's treatment. Their immediate concern was finding water and food. Having left all their supplies behind by midday, they reached the banks of a wide river. The cool water was a blessing, allowing them to drink deeply and clean Samuel's injury more thoroughly. "We'll follow the river north," Samuel decided. "It should lead us to—" He broke off as Najoni suddenly tensed beside him, her head turning sharply toward the forest they had just emerged from. "What is it?" he asked, reaching for the knife they had taken from the camp. "Horses," she whispered. "Many of them." Samuel strained his ears and finally caught what Najoni had already detected, the distant sound of hoofbeats, growing steadily louder. The sound of approaching horsemen left them with few options. The river before them was swift and deep. Crossing it would be risky, especially with Samuel wounded. The forest behind offered concealment, but would trap them if the pursuers spread. "Out to search. We need to split up," Samuel said urgently. "I'll lead them away while you cross the river." Najoni's eyes flashed with determination. "No, we stay together." Before Samuel could argue, she was scanning their surroundings with focused intensity. Her gaze settled on a spot downriver where the bank rose into a rocky overhang. "There," she said, pointing. "Under those rocks. The water has carved out a space." They moved quickly along the riverbank, the sound of the approaching riders growing ever louder. As they reached the overhang, Najoni slipped into the water, gesturing for Samuel to follow. The river's current was strong but navigable as they waded along the bank, staying close to the rocks. Beneath the overhang, they discovered what Najoni had somehow known would be there, a shallow cave worn into the riverbank, its entrance mostly underwater, but with enough space inside to keep their heads above water. They pressed themselves as far back as possible, the cold river flowing around their shoulders. Minutes later, the thundering of hooves reached the riverbank they had just left. Through the curtain of water flowing over the cave entrance, they could make out the blurred shapes of mounted men, at least a dozen, more than just the bounty hunters who had captured them. The soldiers had joined the hunt. "Check upstream and down," a voice commanded. "They can't have gone far. The man is wounded." The riders dispersed, several continuing along the riverbank in both directions. Samuel and Najoni remained motionless. In their hiding place, the frigid water numbing their bodies as hours crawled by. Occasionally, riders would pass near their position, but none discovered their underwater sanctuary. As dusk approached, Samuel's condition worsened. The cold water had slowed the bleeding from his wound, but it had also drained his strength. His face had grown pale, and he shivered uncontrollably. "We need to move soon," Najoni whispered, her own lips blue with cold. "You'll die if we stay in this water much longer." Samuel nodded weakly. After full dark, he managed through chattering. Teeth. When night finally fell, they cautiously emerged from their hiding place. Samuel could barely stand, leaning heavily on Nijoni as they made their way up the riverbank. The forest was silent around them, but they knew the soldiers might still be nearby, perhaps making camp until morning. "We need shelter and fire," Nijoni said, supporting Samuel's weight. "And I need to treat your wound properly." They moved slowly through the darkness, Nijoni guiding them with an instinctive sense of direction that Samuel had long ago stopped questioning. After nearly an hour of difficult progress, they came upon what appeared to be an abandoned trapper's hut, half collapsed but still offering some protection from the elements. Inside, Nijoni helped Samuel lie down on a bed of pine boughs she hastily gathered. His skin burned with fever now, the wound in his side red and angry. "Stay with me," she murmured as she worked to build a small, smokeless fire using techniques her people had perfected over generations. "I need to find plants to draw out the infection." Samuel drifted in and out of consciousness as Nijoni tended to him through the night. She applied poultices made from plants gathered around the hut, forced him to drink bitter-tasting teas, and kept his fever at bay with cool cloths dipped in a nearby stream. For 3 days and nights, Samuel hovered between life and death while Nijoni fought to save him. She hardly slept, constantly checking his fever, changing his bandages, and slipping away briefly to gather more medicinal plants or to hunt small game for sustenance. On the 4th morning, Samuel woke with his mind clear for the first time. Nijoni was asleep beside him, exhaustion having finally claimed her. Her face, even in sleep, showed the strain of the past day's dark circles beneath her eyes and new lines of worry around her mouth. Samuel watched her for a long moment, his heart swelling with a father's pride and something more, a profound respect for the woman she had become. Without her knowledge and skills, he would surely have died. When Nijoni woke, she immediately reached for his forehead, checking his temperature. "The fever has broken," she said, relief evident in her voice. "Thanks to you," Samuel replied. Weakly, "You saved my life, little doe." She smiled at the childhood nickname. "We're even now." As Samuel regained his strength over the following days, they began to plan their next move. The soldiers would eventually give up the search, but returning to any settled areas would be dangerous. "I've been thinking," Nijoni said one evening as they shared a meal of rabbit stew, "about what Mrs. Davis said before we left Pinecrest." Samuel raised an eyebrow. "The school teacher?" Nijoni nodded. "She mentioned her brother lives in Oregon. Said the people there are more accepting of different kinds of families." "Oregon," Samuel repeated thoughtfully. "That's a long journey." "Yes," she agreed, "but what's waiting for us here except more running?" Samuel considered her words. They had been fleeing for so long, first from the memories of what had happened to Nijoni's people, then from the prejudice of the settlements, and now from the law itself. Perhaps it was time to stop running and find a place where they could truly begin again. "Tell me more about this Oregon," he said. Nijoni's face brightened. "Mrs. Davis said there are forests thicker than any we've seen, and mountains that touch the clouds. Game is plentiful, and her brother works as a guide for settlers. She said he could use a partner who knows the wilderness." "And you, what would you do there?" "Learn," she said simply. "Mrs. Davis wrote a letter for me to give to the school there. She said they might let me study, maybe even teach someday." Her eyes shone with a hope Samuel hadn't seen in years. "I could help other children caught between two worlds." 2 weeks later, when Samuel's wound had healed enough for travel, they set out westward. The journey would be long and fraught with danger, but for the first time in years, they moved with purpose rather than fear. They traveled by night when crossing open country, avoiding settlements and military outposts. When they needed supplies, Samuel would approach small homesteads alone, trading furs and offering to work for what they needed. Most frontier families were too. busy with their own survival, to ask questions about a solitary trapper. As they crossed the Continental Divide, the landscape began to change. The stark beauty of the mountains gave way to rolling hills, and eventually to forests so vast and green that they seemed to stretch to the edge of the world. One morning, as they made camp on a ridge overlooking a valley shrouded in mist, Nijoni stood watching the sunrise with a peaceful expression Samuel had rarely seen. "We're going to make it, aren't we?" she asked without turning. Samuel joined her at the edge of the ridge. "Yes," he said with quiet certainty. "We're going to make it." "When we reach Oregon," Nijoni said hesitantly, "will you tell people I'm your daughter?" Samuel looked at her in surprise. "You are my daughter in every way that matters." She nodded, her eyes still fixed on the horizon. "The Apache have a saying, blood makes you related. Loyalty makes you family." "Wise words," Samuel commented. "My mother used to say them," Nijoni said softly. It was the first time she had ever mentioned her birth family. "I was very young, but I remember her voice." Samuel remained silent, giving her space to continue if she wished. "I used to be angry," she admitted after a moment. "At the soldiers for what they did to my people. At the settlers for taking our lands. Sometimes even at you, for not being Apache." She turned to face him. "But I'm not angry anymore. You taught me that family isn't about where you come from, but who stays beside you when the storm comes." Samuel felt his throat tighten with emotion. "You taught me the same thing, little doe." As the sun rose fully above the mountains, bathing the valley below in golden light, Samuel Wheeler and his daughter Nijoni stood side by side, looking toward a future neither could have imagined that bitter winter day, so many years ago, when fate had brought them together in the snow. They had lost much along the way: a cabin filled with memories, the security of familiar surroundings, even their place in the world they had known. But they had found something far more valuable: a family forged not by blood, but by choice, by sacrifice, and by the unbreakable bond between a lonely frontiersman and a little Apache girl who had saved his life in more ways than one.